Europe, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, was a continent shaped by centuries of tradition. Fields stretched across the countryside, dotted with small villages and bustling market towns. Life revolved around the rhythms of the land sowing, harvesting, and the steady turn of the seasons. Artisans plied their trades in workshops, weaving cloth by hand and forging tools with centuries-old methods. Yet beneath the familiar patterns, subtle changes were at work. New ideas circulated through coffeehouses, inventors tinkered in barns, and merchants looked to distant markets. Inefficiencies in production and the pressures of a growing population pressed upon old systems, hinting that transformation was inevitable. As the 18th century unfolded, these pressures collided with unprecedented innovation, unleashing forces that would redefine work, society, and the very landscape of Europe. To understand the Industrial Revolution is to trace the roots of the modern world to its first tremors of change. Before the thunder of engines and the smoky haze of factory chimneys, Europe moved to a different rhythm. The centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution, roughly before 1760 to 1840, were shaped by a world of fields, workshops, and village markets. This pre-industrial era was not a single unbroken tradition, but a complex tapestry of economic activity, social structures, and early innovations that quietly set the stage for transformation. Most people in Europe during this period lived in rural communities, bound to the land and the turning of the seasons. Agriculture formed the backbone of the economy, providing food, work, and the basis for wealth. The feudal system, with its intricate ties between lords, peasants, and the land, had long defined rural life and societal hierarchy. Over time, these structures evolved and weakened in some regions, yet a recognizable peasantry persisted, especially in Western Europe. Parochialism, loyalty to local customs and close-knit communities remained strong, as most people rarely traveled far from where they were born. Yet to imagine pre-industrial Europe as static or backward would be a mistake. Far from being stagnant, many parts of the continent buzzed with specialized occupations and economic diversity. In places like early 18th century Newcastle, the economy was alive with activity. Coal loaders, watermen, mariners, shipwrights, and other workers made their living not just from the land, but from a growing range of trades tied to emerging urban centers and regional commerce. This variety challenges the old notion that pre-industrial economies were limited or primitive. Instead, evidence points to a vibrant mosaic of economic roles, even before the arrival of factories and mass production. Within towns and cities, guilds stood as pillars of pre-industrial society. These associations of craftsmen and merchants controlled much of the urban economy for centuries, shaping not only production, but also professional conduct and social standing. Guilds regulated who could practice particular trades, maintained standards of quality, and protected the interests of their members. In medieval and early modern Europe, membership was highly prized, though often restricted. Women and minorities, for instance, faced significant barriers to entry. For those who gained admission, the guild provided mutual aid and a degree of security in uncertain times. The craft guild system was more than just a means of economic control. It was a powerful engine for transmitting skills and nurturing innovation. Through long apprenticeships, young workers learned not only the secrets of their trade, but also the habits and networks that sustained specialized labor markets. Over 8 centuries, guilds set rules for economic life, ensuring that knowledge was preserved and, in some cases, spread to neighboring regions. Yet the guilds had their limitations. Their strict regulations could slow the adoption of new techniques, and as rural manufacturing expanded, the so-called putting out system emerged as a formidable competitor. In this arrangement, merchants provided raw materials to rural households, who then spun, wove, or assembled goods outside the control of traditional urban guilds. This competition foreshadowed the coming shift toward more flexible forms of production. Alongside the craft traditions, agriculture was experiencing its own quiet revolution. By the 18th century, agricultural improvement was well underway in parts of Europe, particularly in England. This was the golden age of agrarian capitalism, a period when landowners and enterprising farmers invested savings into making their land more productive, draining marshes, introducing new crops, experimenting with crop rotations, and improving livestock breeds. The enclosure movement, which consolidated scattered strips of land into larger, more efficient farms, often at the expense of smallholders, was transforming the countryside. Most capital investment went into agriculture, reflecting its central role in the economy and its potential for growth. Property rights, historians generally agree, became increasingly important during this era. The ability to own, improve, and transfer land gave rise to new incentives to invest in both land and labor. This relationship between property rights and economic development is now seen as a critical precondition for the later surge of industrialization. As rural productivity improved, population growth followed, providing both a larger workforce and a growing market for goods. The stage was being set for change, though few at the time could have guessed how profound that change would be. In towns and rural cottages alike, textile production remained a vital activity. Before factories, the making of cloth was a cottage industry, often organized by merchants who supplied wool and collected finished goods for sale at distant markets. British wool, in particular, was a prized export, and the fortunes of many communities rose and fell with the trade. Mechanization had not yet arrived, but pressures for greater efficiency and the rising demand for textiles would soon fuel the search for new methods. Technological innovation, meanwhile, was not absent in pre-industrial Europe. The Middle Ages and early modern periods saw the spread of key inventions: iron casting, improved water mills, windmills, and mechanical clocks. The three-field crop rotation system, adapted from earlier traditions, allowed for more sustainable agriculture. Gunpowder, paper, and porcelain, often borrowed from other societies, found their place in European workshops. The emergence of veterinary science and the first engineering schools hinted at the growing respect for technical knowledge. Still, it is important to note that for much of this era, Europe lagged behind regions like China in technological advancement. Only after the 15th century did European innovation begin to accelerate, with Britain emerging as a leader in the late 17th century. Despite these advances, the social structure remained relatively stable. Most people were tied to traditional hierarchies and local customs. The division of labor was limited, and variation among social classes was less pronounced than it would become. Artisans and guilds still dominated production, their traditions shaping not only economic life, but also the rhythm of daily existence. As the 18th century unfolded, the foundations of change grew firmer. Capital, people, and ideas increasingly flowed between town and countryside. Transport, trade, finance, and access to raw materials became ever more important. Rural manufacturing, the weakening of guild monopolies, and agricultural improvement all contributed to a new dynamism, particularly in England, which by 1750 had become a high-income economy compared to its neighbors. The world before the Industrial Revolution was, then, neither wholly static nor entirely prepared for what was to come. It was a world of continuity and gradual evolution, marked by enduring customs and the first stirrings of modernity. In these fields and workshops, in the quiet calculations of landowners and the careful work of apprentices, the seeds of transformation were sown, seeds that would soon erupt into the world, changing upheaval of the Industrial Revolution. In the last decades of the 18th century, something extraordinary began to take root in Britain, a transformation so profound that it would ripple across Europe, forever altering the fabric of everyday life. The world of handcraft and muscle power was giving way to machines, and a new era of industry was dawning. This was the Industrial Revolution, a period stretching roughly from 1750 to 1850, marked by a clear shift. Human societies were moving from traditional, labor-intensive production to mechanized, factory-based systems. The driving force behind this change, quite literally, was the engine itself, along with a host of other inventions that would reshape economies, cities, and even the rhythms of daily existence. Britain's early and explosive lead in industrialization was no accident. Its landscape was rich in coal and iron, the essential materials that would power and build the new machines. Productive agriculture, which had already transformed the countryside, meant that more people could leave the land and seek work elsewhere. Just as importantly, Britain was home to a generation of inventors and entrepreneurs whose ambition was matched by their ingenuity. Among these pioneers, James Hargreaves stands out for his 1764 invention of the spinning jenny. This ingenious device allowed a single worker to spin multiple spools of thread at once, dramatically increasing textile productivity. Soon after, Richard Arkwright's water frame and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule further revolutionized spinning, setting the stage for the textile industry to become the beating heart of the new industrial order. In weaving, John Kay's flying shuttle, introduced in 1733, sped up the process and made wider fabrics possible. Each invention built upon the last, unleashing a surge of cotton and woolen goods onto the market. The textile mills that sprang up were among the first true factories, bringing together workers and machines under one roof and operating on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet it was the harnessing of steam that truly ignited the Industrial Revolution. The story began with Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric steam engine in 1712, a cumbersome but effective device for pumping water out of mines. But it was James Watt who, in the 1760s, transformed the steam engine into a far more efficient and versatile power source. Watt's improvements, especially his separate condenser, meant that steam engines could now drive not only pumps, but also the looms and spinning machines of textile mills, the hammers of ironworks, and, eventually, the wheels of new forms of transport. iron, too, experienced a revolution. In 1709, Abraham Darby's use of coke instead of charcoal in blast furnaces allowed for much greater iron production. Over the following decades, advances in iron founding and the rise of precision machine tools made it possible to build larger, stronger, and more reliable machines. The sinews of the Industrial Revolution were forged in these foundries, with iron and, later, steel becoming the backbone of the new industrial economy. The rise of the factory system was more than a technological change, it was a reordering of society itself. Work that had once been organized in small workshops or rural homes was now concentrated in large buildings where machines set the pace of labor. The factory whistle replaced the church bell as the signal for daily life, and the constant hum of machinery became the new soundtrack of the age. Urban centers swelled as people flocked to growing towns in search of employment. Life in the factories, however, was often harsh. Long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions were common, and the crowded cities that grew up around the mills and foundries became symbols of both progress and profound social upheaval. The impact of steam reached far beyond the factory gates. The earliest steam-powered locomotives appeared in Britain in the early 19th century, with the first steam railway journey taking place in 1804. Soon, railroads began to snake across the landscape, linking towns and cities, moving raw materials to factories, and carrying finished goods to distant markets. Improved roads, canals, and, most dramatically, the railways transformed the geography of England and Wales, connecting regions that had once been separated by distance and poor transport. Britain's industrial lead did not go unchallenged. Across the Channel, France emerged as a major competitor. Although France's industrialization followed a somewhat different path, placing greater emphasis on luxury goods and the mechanization of traditional trades, the country nonetheless became a significant center of invention and industrial activity. French manufacturers adapted many of the new British machines to their own needs. The spread of mechanized production in France, though sometimes slower and more regionally uneven than in Britain, contributed to the broader European transformation. Theories abound as to why Britain was first. Some scholars point to the abundance of coal and iron, the black diamonds and red gold that powered and built the new machines. Others highlight institutional factors such as property rights, access to capital, and a legal system that encouraged innovation. High wages in Britain may have pushed inventors and manufacturers to seek labor-saving devices, while a culture of entrepreneurship provided fertile ground for new ideas. Global trade also played its part, supplying raw materials and opening distant markets. Engineering as a discipline came into its own during this period, as the challenges of designing, building, and maintaining ever more complex machines called for new kinds of expertise. Between 1750 and 1850, engineers became central figures in solving the myriad technical problems posed by large-scale industry. The age's signature inventions, whether James Watt's steam engine or Josiah Wedgwood's advances in pottery, were as much triumphs of engineering as of science. The changes were not confined to factories and railways. Agriculture, too, was swept up in the technological tide, with the introduction of new machines like the seed drill and the adoption of improved crop rotations. Large-scale commercial farming began to take hold, and rural populations increasingly found themselves drawn into the orbit of the industrial towns. By the close of the early 19th century, the outlines of a new world were unmistakable. Rural societies, once defined by the rhythms of the seasons and the cycles of hand production, were giving way to urban, industrialized ones. The landscapes of Britain and, gradually, the rest of Europe were transformed by mills, smokestacks, and railway lines. The Industrial Revolution's engines of progress, textiles, iron, steam, and transport, had set societies on a course of change whose consequences would resonate for generations to come. Imagine the streets of a British city in the early 19th century, alive with restless energy as people from the countryside flood in, searching for work and a new life. This was the human side of industrialization, a wave of migration that swept millions from quiet villages into an unfamiliar world of brick, smoke, and constant activity. The enclosure movement and a growing population uprooted families, sending them to urban centers that expanded at a remarkable pace. By the middle of the century, half of Britain's people lived in towns, an unprecedented shift that would reshape society at every level. For many, the promise of steady wages drew them to the city, but the reality was far from idyllic. The move from rural to urban life brought profound changes to daily existence. Traditional family ties were stretched thin as people left the land behind. In the cramped quarters of industrial towns, the extended family, once the foundation of rural support, often gave way to the nuclear family, a change noted by social theorists such as Talcott Parsons. As workers crowded into tenements near factories, The family economy that had once provided food, shelter, and work under one roof was transformed into a unit of consumption. Families now spent their earnings on goods and services from the marketplace, their economic role sharply reduced compared to earlier times. The rhythm of life itself changed. Factory bells replaced the cadence of the seasons, dictating long hours of labor that stretched from dawn into the night. This new world of work was defined by the factory, a place of regimented routines and unfamiliar dangers. The need for cheap, plentiful labor meant that not only men but also women and children joined the industrial workforce. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, toiled in mills and mines, often for 12 hours or more each day. They faced harsh conditions, the roar of machinery, stifling heat, and the constant risk of injury. Women, too, became a vital part of the workforce, yet their wages were typically lower than those of men, reflecting deeply ingrained social hierarchies. With the rise of factory labor, traditional skills and crafts declined. Mechanization made tasks repetitive and required little training, disconnecting workers from the finished product. The pride and autonomy that came from skilled work were replaced by monotony and discipline. The sheer scale of new industrial enterprises created a vast working class, separated not only by wealth, but also by experience from the emerging middle class, who often reaped the benefits of industrial progress. This division would become a defining feature of 19th century society. Urbanization brought challenges that cities were unprepared to handle. Housing was thrown up hastily, often without proper planning, drainage, or sanitation. Overcrowding became common, with entire families squeezed into single rooms. Streets filled with refuse, and rivers ran black with industrial waste. Pollution cloaked the cities in smoke, while the air carried the stench of uncollected garbage and untreated sewage. In these conditions, disease flourished. Outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis swept through working-class neighborhoods, claiming lives at a devastating rate, especially among young children. In the second quarter of the 19th century, mortality rates in Britain's cities soared, a grim consequence of high population density and inadequate public health measures. The physical environment of the industrial city was not the only source of hardship. The lack of worker protections meant that laborers faced long hours, meager pay, and little recourse if they were injured or dismissed. Factories and mines were dangerous places, with accidents a daily occurrence and safety regulations virtually non-existent. The relentless pace of production left workers with little time or energy for anything beyond survival. Crime rates rose as poverty and desperation took hold in overcrowded neighborhoods. Public authorities and private philanthropists responded to these crises, sometimes establishing basic health services or attempting to improve drainage and sanitation. Yet, progress was slow, and for many, the benefits of industrialization seemed out of reach. Amid these hardships, new social identities began to form. The working class, though fragmented by region and occupation, found common cause and shared experiences. Protests and strikes erupted as workers demanded better conditions and higher wages. Some, like the Luddites, turned to direct action, destroying machines they blamed for taking their jobs. Others sought change through organization, leading to the rise of labor unions, an early step in the long struggle for workers' rights. The middle class, meanwhile, experienced the era's transformations in a markedly different way. Industrialization brought prosperity, new forms of leisure, and access to consumer goods that were once unimaginable. Middle-class families moved into houses with gardens and enjoyed the fruits of technological progress, while their children attended the new public schools emerging in response to the needs of industrial society. These stark contrasts in living standards and expectations helped solidify the boundaries between social classes, fueling both aspiration and resentment. Despite the many difficulties, life in the industrial city was not without opportunity. The rapid expansion of urban centers led to improvements in transport, with new roads and railways making it possible for people and goods to move as never before. Over time, public services began to evolve, and efforts to address health and housing problems, though uneven, laid the groundwork for reforms that would gradually improve conditions for all. Observing these changes, Friedrich Engels focused his attention on the lives of workers in England, documenting the squalor and struggle that defined the age. His work stands as a testament to the resilience of those who endured the upheavals of industrialization and to the urgent need for social reform. The Industrial Revolution was more than a story of machines and markets, it was a transformation of the human experience. As Europe's cities swelled and factories multiplied, millions found their lives upended. Old ways of living and working gave way to new routines, and the ties that bound communities were tested as never before. Yet, out of this crucible of hardship and hope, new possibilities emerged, shaping not only the cities and societies of the 19th century, but also the world we inhabit today. As the smoke of new industry drifted across European skylines and the relentless rhythm of machines echoed through city streets, the winds of change swept far beyond the factory walls. The Industrial Revolution reshaped not only economies and landscapes, but also the very fabric of political power, cultural life, and the ways people understood their place in society. The consequences of this era radiated outward, touching every aspect of European civilization and setting in motion new forces that would define the modern world. At the heart of these changes was a dramatic shift in economic thought and organization. For centuries, European wealth had grown slowly, often limited by the constraints of agriculture and manual craft. But in the 18th century, this pattern broke. Per capita gross domestic product in Britain, stagnant for generations, began to soar, an unmistakable sign that technological innovation and the move from fields to factories were rewriting the rules of prosperity. The emergence of modern capitalism was more than an economic event. It was a revolution in how people conceived of work, value, and opportunity. As factories multiplied and cities swelled, the old social orders that had structured Europe, landed aristocracy, rural peasantry, and guild-bound tradesmen, gave way to new classes and relationships. The distinction between those who owned the means of production and those who did not became a defining feature of this new society, deepening both opportunity and inequality. Into this world stepped thinkers like Adam Smith, whose vision of industrialization as a process of unfettered economic growth captured the spirit of the age. Smith and his contemporaries saw in the factory and the market the engines of progress, capable of creating wealth on a scale never before imagined. Yet the rise of capitalism also brought new tensions and debates. As wealth accumulated in the hands of factory owners and financiers, and as workers crowded into the tenements of industrial towns, questions about justice, rights, and the distribution of wealth came to the fore. The dramatic expansion of the middle class, itself a product of economic transformation, added new voices to these debates. With its appetite for education, culture, and political influence, the middle class challenged both aristocratic privilege and the hardships of the working poor. Political power, too, began to shift. The Industrial Revolution was not only an economic phenomenon but also a catalyst for democratization. Scholars note that democratization was a key factor linking industrialization to reductions in income inequality. As wealth and influence spread, however imperfectly, from the old elite to new industrialists and the growing middle class, demands for greater representation, civil liberties, and legal protections intensified. In Britain and elsewhere, the push for reform found expression in new political movements, parliamentary reforms, and the gradual extension of the vote. Industrialization, in this sense, helped lay the foundations for modern democracy, giving rise to institutions and expectations that would, over time, reshape the relationship between governments and citizens. Yet the story was not one of unbroken progress or harmony. The social structure of industrial Europe was marked by stark divisions between owners and non-owners, managers and workers, men and women. The expansion of production and the reorganization of labor created both winners and losers, fueling new forms of conflict and collective action. Reformers, witnessing the hardships and dangers of industrial life, began to organize for change. In both Britain and the United States, activists campaigned for worker protections, public health measures, and broader social reforms. Movements for women's rights gained strength, challenging the legal and cultural barriers that had long excluded women from full participation in economic and civic life. Social activism flourished, driven by the conviction that progress must be measured not only in economic terms, but also by improvements in justice, health, and dignity. The consequences of industrialization rippled outward into the world of ideas and the arts. Freed from the exclusive patronage of the aristocracy, artists found new sources of inspiration and support. The materials and subjects of art shifted, reflecting the realities and anxieties of industrial society. Artworks from the mid-19th century often explored the theme of labor, capturing both the dynamism and the alienation of the factory age. The Impressionists, in particular, responded to the changing tempo of life. Painters like Claude Monet absorbed the speed, efficiency, and fleeting impressions of the modern world, translating them into new ways of seeing and representing time. Their canvases depicted not only the urban bustle and transforming landscapes, but also the impact of mechanization on everyday life, including the shifting roles of men and women. Industrialization also expanded the boundaries of education and knowledge. As new industries demanded a skilled and adaptable workforce, traditional forms of schooling proved insufficient. The period saw the development of general education curricula designed to meet the needs of an industrial society. Schools began to emphasize scientific and technical knowledge, giving rise to new academic disciplines. Higher education expanded, and new professions emerged to serve the growing complexity of industrial economies. Mandatory education became more common, and specialized training schools prepared students for careers in engineering, management, and other fields required by modern industry. Although the pace and extent of these changes varied, the impact was unmistakable. Education became a central pillar of social mobility and progress. The enduring legacy of the Industrial Revolution is visible in the way it transformed economic, social, technological, and cultural landscapes. Europe's brief technological lead, historians note, was not the result of inherent cultural superiority, but rather of access to fossil fuels and the practical application of industrial technology. The new age brought with it both promise and peril, greater wealth and opportunity, but also new forms of inequality and risk. The debates and reforms sparked by industrialization laid the groundwork for the ongoing struggle to define progress and justice in modern societies. As the 19th century drew to a close, Europeans looked back on a world utterly changed by coal and steam, by railways and factories, by new ideas about freedom, equality, and the meaning of work. The winds of change that began with the first turning wheels of industry had carried Europe into an uncertain but undeniably modern age. When we pause to consider the enduring legacy of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, we find ourselves witnessing a story still unfolding, a narrative that continues to shape our world, for better and for worse. The echoes of that era surround us, woven into the fabric of our daily lives, our economies, and even our landscapes. The Industrial Revolution was never simply about machines and smokestacks. Its true legacy lies in the profound transformation of how people lived, worked, thought, and imagined the future. One of the most striking lessons from the Industrial Revolution is the remarkable speed with which technology can remake society. Looking back at the archives and primary sources from the period, petitions from textile workers and essays by social critics, it is clear that contemporaries felt swept up in a whirlwind. The sudden arrival of new machines, new rhythms of work, and new ways of organizing life left many feeling both exhilarated and anxious. This duality, hope mixed with uncertainty, has remained a hallmark of technological revolutions ever since. The advantages brought by industrialization were substantial. Productivity soared as the harnessing of steam, coal, and later electricity enabled factories to produce goods on a scale far beyond traditional handicraft. This surge in output did not stay within the factory walls. It radiated outward, reshaping cities, fueling the rise of new businesses, and driving the expansion of markets. The emergence of modern capitalism, with its focus on profit, investment, and constant innovation, can be traced directly to this period. The Industrial Revolution also transformed global trade, creating interconnected markets and fostering economic growth on an unprecedented scale. Markets in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas became more closely linked, and goods produced in European factories reached many parts of the globe. Yet these advancements came with challenges that remain deeply relevant today. The new industrial order brought not only wealth and opportunity, but also hardship and turmoil. As productivity climbed and fortunes were made, the gap between rich and poor often widened. Labor activism, so prominent during the period, arose not from abstract theory, but from daily experience. Workers organized, protested, and sometimes rebelled against the relentless pace and harsh conditions of industrial life. Reform movements emerged to address the social dislocation and inequality that accompanied rapid change. Many of the demands and strategies pioneered by 19th-century labor activists, calls for fair wages, safer workplaces, and social protections, still resonate in present-day debates about the future of work. Another lesson from the Industrial Revolution is the enduring power of collective action. The era's reformers and activists showed that those at the bottom of the economic ladder need not remain passive victims of change. Through petitions, strikes, and the patient work of building organizations, working people secured concessions and reforms that shaped subsequent generations. Scholars believe the legacy of these movements is visible in the labor laws, social safety nets, and broader democratic participation found in many societies today. The struggles of the Industrial Revolution era continue to inspire and remind us that progress is rarely automatic or evenly distributed. The environmental consequences of the Industrial Revolution form a critical part of its legacy. The rapid expansion of industry and urban life was powered by fossil fuels, coal above all, leading to a dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions. This reliance on coal and later oil and gas did more than darken the skies over European cities. It set humanity on a path toward large-scale environmental change. The impact is still felt today. Pollution, climate change, and the depletion of natural resources are all, in part, the inheritance of that first leap into industrial modernity. The Industrial Revolution's environmental impact has become a cautionary tale, prompting scientists and policymakers to grapple with the challenge of sustainability, how to balance technological advancement and economic growth with stewardship of the planet. Reflecting on these challenges brings us to the lessons the Industrial Revolution offers for our own era of rapid technological change. Just as 19th century societies struggled to adapt to steam engines and mechanized factories, today's world faces the disruptive potential of digital technologies, automation, and globalization. The parallels are striking. Then, as now, technological progress brings new opportunities alongside uncertainty and risk. The response is crafted in the 19th century to organize, to legislate, and to imagine new futures remain instructive. They remind us that technological revolutions are not just about inventions, but about the choices societies make in response to them. The Industrial Revolution also began a cycle of transformation that has continued through subsequent waves of innovation. Historians often speak of not one, but several industrial revolutions, each building on the last, each bringing new challenges and possibilities. From the age of steam and iron to the rise of electricity, chemicals, and information technology, the template set in the late 18th and early 19th centuries has proved remarkably durable. Business, government, and society have all been shaped by the imperative to adapt, to innovate, and to manage the consequences of change. Equally important is the lesson that industrialization is not a single, uniform process, but a complex, uneven journey. Each society has navigated its own path, shaped by local conditions, institutions, and choices. The documents and primary sources from the period show there was no single right way to industrialize. Instead, there were debates, experiments, and sometimes bitter disagreements about the meaning and direction of progress. This diversity of experience reminds us that history rarely offers simple answers. The legacies of the Industrial Revolution, both positive and negative, are not fixed, but are constantly being reinterpreted and renegotiated. At its core, the story of the Industrial Revolution is about transformation of economies, landscapes, societies, and human aspirations. It is a story of invention and reinvention, of struggle and adaptation, of promise and peril. The lessons it offers are as relevant now as they were 2 centuries ago, that technological progress brings both opportunity and challenge, that collective action and reform are essential to managing change, that environmental stewardship cannot be ignored, and that the choices made in times of upheaval echo across generations. As we look to the future, the legacy of the Industrial Revolution remains a powerful reminder of our capacity to shape our world and our responsibility to do so wisely.